Welcome to the LDHR podcast, the place to learn, explore, develop, and connect so that we and those we lead are known, needed, and have a future. In this series, we're exploring our member care model and discovering what it looks like to live out and lead through master care, self-care, team care, and movement care. We will hear from people all over the world how they're living this out and how we can learn from them. Come on in and listen. We're so glad you're here. Hi, Kathy Horne. Welcome to the LDHR podcast. I'm really glad that you're able to join me today. Before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about where you serve and what your current role is?
Sure. Too, and being part of this podcast, I've been serving in London for the last 15 years, doing some workplace ministry. I currently am the well-being team lead for Agapé UK. Still living in London.
Oh, fantastic. That's great. So we are looking at the second component of our member care model today, focusing on self-care and really realizing that longevity and leadership and ministry doesn't happen accidentally. It's built by making healthy choices over time. So kind of as you've been thinking about your time in ministry and your career, how has your view of self-care evolved during that time?
Yeah, I think perhaps maybe we can go back to defining what self-care is, because I think in my couple of decades of being in full-time Christian ministry, I don't know if self-care has been defined as such until more in the last decade, what that really means and how that is effective or how that affects your ministry. And I know that I think it's the global member care framework talks about that as more on the spiritual side of things, like looking after yourself, which includes prayer, finding support, which is all part of self-care, and that we are responsible for that component as an individual and seeking out that. And as we look in the more, I guess, the Global Federation of Care probably defines it more as health and perhaps in general. So I would include that as health being the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being of somebody that then helps you to make the right choices in order for us to do what we're called to do.
Absolutely. A much more holistic.
Yes. So as far as it being evolving, I think intrinsically, I think all of us have touched on those over our lifetime, but I think as more recently looking at this in a more holistic way, like you said.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Make sure we have a clear definition out there. Yeah, I agree with you. Definitely much more of that holistic approach is great because we are whole beings.
Yeah.
We aren't just spiritual beings. We have a physical body, and there's lots of other components as well. So was there a moment or a season that really forced you to take self-care seriously?
Well, I'll have to include age, realizing that I don't recover or bounce back as quickly as I used to. And that is, I think, they do say, the older, the wiser, and just being more self-aware that those things, I can't take that for granted anymore. And I think I went through a difficult time of bereavement the last decade. And so my physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual tanks were depleted. And I was desperate to just let each day pass. And it was the community around me, my friends and family, my church community, the Agapé community, that just gave me permission to just be, and also be very practical in the way they looked after me. So whether it was just a simple meal or a message or just hanging out, was just ways in which I became more mindful of how I was doing. Sometimes just taking the permission of receiving the permission to just take each day at a time. And I really took that to heart because when you are going through a difficult time, when you are grieving, you can really literally just take each day at a time, and having other people make decisions for you, and then also giving me agency. So I remember somebody just really asking me questions and giving me choices, kind of as you do like a child. Do you want this or do you want this? And that was a little bit more palatable than giving me a wide range of choices. And also, they were being much more open to what my needs are instead of assuming what I needed. So that was really helpful in terms of how I took self care more seriously. It wasn't just me one day choosing. I think I was forced to have to do that based on my outside circumstances.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing a little bit about that time that you went through over, like you said, over the course of the last decade. But I really like that you highlighted that it was the community that kind of even helped you take self care more seriously. Where I tend to think, okay, self care, it's just me, myself, I'll take care of me. But really, the community does play a huge part in that, and that they were able to come alongside you, kind of give you some of that agency to be able to take care of yourself. I think that's a really beautiful picture. So, have you ever, I don't know, felt guilty for resting or for pulling back? And if so, how did you deal with that?
I am a doer, and there's a bit of, when you hear somebody say, "Oh, well done, good job," it does motivate you to do and to be more. And so I confess that I do feel guilty for not resting. And recently, my my husband's like, "I am the Manny Pacquiao of rest." So I think what he means by that is that rest to me is it doesn't come very easy for me. I think we need to redefine rest as well. Resting for some people may be just stopping rest, but then some people might define rest as something that gives you fulfillment, and that could be very restful. So for me, maybe something that is mindless, but I'm actually doing something, whether it's with my hands or, whether it's cooking or walking, that may prove to be more restful than just sitting and doing nothing. I think having discipline in just part of the physical aspect of rest. So ensuring that I have good sleep, ensuring that I have that sort of sleep hygiene where I take that time to actually then sleep well, eating well, being among other people, finding that social aspect can be very restful for me. Having alone time can be very restful for me. So it's just those markers when you know that I'm about to have a meltdown or just like, all right, just being aware that something might tip me over the edge emotionally and taking that step back. Unfortunately, sometimes I step over that line and, the meltdown happens or the words come out or the shutting down happens. Those all happen a little too late after the fact, but then taking a step back and resetting. So I think for doers, it's just maybe understanding what rest actually means for you. At least for me, because I'm a doer. So rest just might look a little bit more differently than other
What?
people. So it's just redefining what rest is. But I have been guilty. And what steps have I taken? Well, just understanding that sometimes I do step over the line and having to just take a step back, take stock, confess, say your apologies, and move forward. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as we're talking about self care being holistic, it makes sense that pulling back and resting is going to look different kind of for those different aspects, right? Like you touched on physical rest of sleep and good sleep hygiene and those habits. But I can relate to just sometimes doing something mindless just is actually really restful. Yeah. Going for a walk, going for a run. Yeah. Thank you. So, what impact has long term self care had on your effectiveness as a leader?
We always talk about burnout.
Mhm.
You hear other leaders who talk about burnout and then they write books about Sabbath and having an unhurried life. So, I still hoping that I see the fruit of that. Maybe I've seen glimpses of that, but I would hope that, discipleship is caught and not taught. And so perhaps if I can establish that rhythm for me, that it's caught onto other people who are younger in their career as a leader or just in life in general, that they might see how I live my life and that might be caught. So I'm hoping that I'm more empathetic and I'm more curious, more authentic in the way that I do life in ministry. And hopefully that is caught on. But I can see for myself that, I have to be wiser and work smarter and not harder. And perhaps being more authentic and more empathetic and curious for the long-term effects for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really like that. Yeah, being empathetic and curious for yourself, but how that plays out for those that you lead too, I think is really important. And like you said, some of those, as you set some really healthy boundaries for you, other people that you lead are going to see that,
Mhm.
and that'll give them permission to kind of act in that same way too. I think if we're caught in a world that says just go, go, go all the time, it's hard to stop. But having a leader who allows himself to have those healthy boundaries, I think is a really good example for effective leadership.
Yeah.
So, what would you say to a younger leader who feels like they don't have time for self care?
I wonder, I'm not sure what I would say in terms of other than maybe asking more questions. I wonder if there's something underneath their feeling not able to take the time. So I would want to know what's their statement, what's happening underneath that's making them feel like they can't take that time out. And then exploring what it means for them to rest, because perhaps they have a limited view of what rest is, giving them agency. So giving them permission to make their own decisions and then to allow them to explore that and, experience the consequences of their actions, their decisions. Sometimes we just have to allow that to happen. So I think it's just being able to be curious. I would probably, depending on who that person is or feels, I would just want to explore more, ask them what's going on. What does self-care mean to them? Because it might be completely different and not make those assumptions of what, we think it is
Yeah.
or what we think they think it is. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's really helpful because, yeah, we all bring our own assumptions to what maybe that means. And so being curious and asking, what does that mean to you? What does self care look like for you? I think those are some really good questions. And I like what's underneath that? What's behind that? Because I know there is different times in my life when I feel like I've been too busy to do this, or I've been too busy. And it's like, why? Do I legitimately have a reason that life is just super full at that moment? Or do I struggle with the guilt of taking the time off? Or do I struggle with thinking my value is in what I can accomplish? And so I think those are some really good tips for us as leaders and as we're reflecting. And if you're listening to this, to reflect on yourself of like, yeah, what's underneath that? If I feel like I'm too busy to take time for self care, what's underneath that? That's really helpful. Thank you, Kathy. So let's get just a little practical. Like, what slight shift or what is one kind of step that maybe someone could make today that really would lead to lasting health over time? What would you kind of give some advice of some steps that people could take today?
Perhaps asking themselves what it is that gives them life, you know, what sparks joy, and going from there. And then having a dialogue with someone that they trust about these things. If they wanted to embark on this, to maybe have somebody come alongside them and talk about those things that spark joy, give them life, give them rest in that regard. Because, the Sabbath is the rest means something completed, brings fullness, asking and exploring those questions with someone else. One of the things that I've put into place is discipline, and discipline isn't always necessarily fun. And I think as humans, we want to take the path of least resistance, and we will make up every excuse possible. And I think that's why disciplines are called disciplines, because sometimes you have to do them in order to maintain that type of lifestyle or that path that you want to take. And for example, I do run, and there are days, especially in London, I refuse to, but this is why it's called a discipline, because in the end, the benefit outweighs the risk, I guess. So that would be my advice. Talk to somebody else about your desires of wanting to look after yourself, and perhaps what would be the consequence of not taking those steps. What is the other side of not being able to look after yourself? What did that cost for that?
That's a really great question. What is the cost of me not doing this? And maybe people are already experiencing that cost, or maybe they can imagine, look down the road of what would happen if they continued on the path they were on right now. What would happen if they didn't make some changes? So I think that's a really great question. Thank you, Kathy. Are there any resources or things that you have found helpful in your self-care journey that you would like to share?
You probably already heard of Kurt Thompson, but he has a podcast with, I think, his friend Pepper Sweeney, and it's called the Being Known podcast. And he uses neuroscience and spiritual formation in his conversations. And I think that was a real helpful journey for me as far as having discipline and good mental health, and how that helps, how spiritual formation and thinking about neuroscience helps with transforming our minds. So that's one resource for me to have. There's a lot of PubMed. Anything you want to research on like physical health, PubMed's always a good place to start.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. We'll make sure we link to those in the show notes so people can check them out. But thank you for those recommendations. And thank you again for your time. Thanks for, talking a little bit about self-care. Really appreciate your insight and the journey that you've been on. So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today as we took a deep dive into looking at self-care. I pray that you are as encouraged as I was by Kathy's story and the call for us to value our own self-care. Take a moment and think through the questions Kathy brought us today. What brings life to you? And what is the cost of not taking care of yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Next week, we'll hear from Vania Medina in Mexico about ways to prioritize self-care for your team. You don't want to miss it. See you next week.